Welcome to the Politics and Media programme. Chancellor George Osborne famously said that we are all in the recession together. But his budget last week has renewed criticism from that some of us are more in it than others. Specifically, anti-poverty campaigners are arguing that some of the measures that the Chancellor claimed will most help the poor will actually be ineffective. Let's take a look at this report.
The Chancellor, George Osborne, was met with the usual uproar when he set out the government's spending plans for the coming year on Wednesday. He admitted growth is now expected to be just 0.6% for the rest of 2013, half of what he had predicted in December. But there were no signs of a shift in policy, with spending cuts and caps on public sector pay increases set to continue. Calling it a budget for an aspiration nation, language some critics claim deliberately implies that the unemployed are work-shy, Osborne seemed to be reaching out to middle-class families and small businesses.
If you want to own your own home, if you want help with your childcare bills, if you want to start your own business or give someone a job, if you want to save for your retirement and leave your home to your children, if you want to work hard and get on, we are on your side.
But for those at the bottom of the economic pile, the budget had little new to offer. The Chancellor defended his programme of austerity that critics claim is increasing poverty and deprivation, saying there were no easy answers to the country's economic problems. Tower Hamlets in London is one of the most deprived boroughs in the country. People here who are in low-paid jobs will be pleased that from 2014 they won't have to pay tax on the first £10,000 that they earn. There's good news too for parents who are on tax credits. They'll get 85% of their childcare paid for. That's if they both earn enough to be paying income tax. But critics of the budget say the changes will make little difference to the poorest families here. Toynbee Hall in Tower Hamlets has been working with disadvantaged communities here for over 100 years. Its chief executive said some local people would benefit from the new measures set out in the budget, but he wasn't convinced they would soften the blow of austerity for the poorest families in the area.
The people on the lowest incomes, people who aren't going to benefit from the increase to personal allowance or aren't going to benefit so much in terms of the childcare tax relief, I think it's not going to make enough of a difference. And I think the reality is the poverty will increase over the next year or 2 years, and I don't think the budget is going to help that in any shape or form.
On the same day the budget was announced, new figures revealed that the number of people out of work in Britain has risen to 2.5 million. Members of the Public and Commercial Services Union who went on strike on budget day believe austerity is only making unemployment worse. But on the other side of Parliament's walls, George Osborne was making it clear that he believes plugging the government's spending deficit is the only road to economic recovery, and that the coalition is not about to change its course. Emily Churchill, Islam Channel.
Well, with me to discuss the budget are Deven Ghelani, the Director of Policy and Practice, and Tim Nichols, Press and Parliamentary Officer of the Child Poverty Action Group. Welcome to the programme. Tim, so from your point of view, will the budget make a lot of difference to people who are the poorest in the society?
Not a great deal of difference, no. I think that the two big measures in there that the government claimed would be helping are raising the personal allowance higher for taxation to £10,000, and also this new policy on childcare. But if you look at the first one with the personal allowance, well, the very poorest earners don't pay tax already, but a lot of the other poorest earners that are into paying tax are also going to be claiming housing benefit and council tax benefit. What that means is because of the taper in those benefits, that for every extra £1 that they get through the policy, they will lose 85p from the tapers on those benefits. So the actual gain for them is very, very small, and the real gainers are actually those earners that are higher up the income spectrum.
OK, so Deven, the Chancellor, according to the Child Poverty Action Group, seems to be taking with one hand and giving back with the other.
Well, I think given what the last two budgets have done for people on the very lowest incomes, and particularly people on benefits, it's probably in some ways a good thing that this budget hasn't done a great deal, because actually those last two were the ones that will perhaps now, this year, be most hardest felt by the people on the lowest incomes. However, it's probably not fair to say that he's done nothing, because actually some of the reforms he's making to the way benefits work, for example, some of the reforms he's making to the way the tax system works, will actually benefit those that are doing everything they can to increase their earnings.
So Tim, so over time, you're saying over 3 budgets, this is an improvement?
Well, I'd say a lot of the measures that in the first 2 budgets are about to be felt this year, and some of those measures will be felt perhaps most strikingly by people on the lowest incomes.
Do you think that's likely to be the case? Is there something cumulative going on?
There is something cumulative going on. I mean, I think what we're seeing, as Deven points out, that some of the cuts that are going to hit families were announced in previous years, but don't actually come along until now. And as we get closer to the end of the Parliament, it kind of, particularly in the coalition arrangement, where they kind of have their agreements up to the end of the Parliament, but beyond the Parliament, they're into their own separate territory as parties with what they'll be going to the electorate with. And because budget announcements are always looking a fair way ahead, then I think that makes it tougher to have new things that are agreed, unless they're put in more kind of vague terms, which is something we did actually see, that was more one of the points lost in the detail because it wasn't immediately obvious what it was. But there's something called annually managed expenditure. It's a technical term for spends that you know you're going to have every year, but you don't always know exactly how much they're going to be. One of the annual managed expenditure areas is benefits, because you don't know how many people are going to be out of work year to year. And they're talking about possibly putting caps onto that budget, which has never been done before, which in practice could follow through into caps on benefits that would mean more cuts.
So Deven, what do you expect to see? Because I mean, it's been for quite a long period now. We've seen a sort of growing inequality, especially between the very top 10% and the bottom 10%. Do you expect this to be reversed, or are we going to be looking at statistics in 2 or 3 years' time which say it's as bad, if not worse? I
mean, there are 2 points to make here. I think the first one to make is what's happening to the benefit budget and how much we can actually afford as a nation. So we've had a very high growth in spending on benefits over the last decade, number of decades in fact, and that's one aspect of what's being spent on people on the lowest incomes. There's another big change that's happening at the moment as well, which is the way in which the system works and whether it's rewarding decisions for people who are trying to progress off benefits and into work. And in some ways, if you can encourage people to do that, take higher earning work, these are the kinds of changes that the government's making to try and tackle inequality in that way. Whether that's going to make a difference between the top 10% and the bottom 10%, that's probably that's a different sort of question.
What do you expect to see with these figures? If say we're looking back in 3 years' time, do you expect to see the poverty figures reduced or the inequality reduced?
We expect to see them getting worse for children. We just had analysis done before the budget that showed that we're on a trajectory to have an additional 600,000 children go into absolute poverty, and not just relative poverty, but absolute poverty between 2010 and 2015.
You don't have enough to heat the house or to eat or so forth. Not that you're just slipping behind
I mean, it's a little complicated, but it's the relative line moves each year with average earnings. The absolute line, you set it at a baseline year and it doesn't move. So it depends a bit where you set it, how much you can get from that. But certainly with the one that we have at the moment, you would see much more of those kinds of problems. I should point out as well that as Deven has highlighted, the universal credit will have some positive direct impacts on the numbers of families below the poverty line. But the tough thing is that when you look at it, the impact in net with all these other cuts that are taking place, that the net effect of this government's policies, despite the positive push from universal credit, the net effect is highly negative because the level of cuts and the targeting on low-income families is so bad.
It's probably worth mentioning here that it's not just the government's policies that are having an impact. Tim brought up the poverty line in terms of absolute or relative terms, and what's clear is actually last year the number of children in poverty fell, not because their circumstances got particularly better, but because incomes for everyone else in the country got worse, which meant that a number of children were actually better off relative to, a number of children in low-income households were better off relative to the rest of the population. Now that seems to me a slightly bizarre way
That's
of
kind
measuring.
Of bad news
Yes.
statistic, isn't
Yeah,
it? Really?
yeah,
We're all in it together,
well,
but the in it turns out to be poverty.
Exactly, and I guess the only point I wanted to make with that is we are all facing very difficult circumstances, whether you're on middle incomes, low incomes, across the board. Unfortunately, right now we're getting poorer as a nation. I think the questions we need to ask is, are the steps the government's taking taking us toward growth, taking us toward prosperity, taking us in that general direction? I think in some respects they are. There's always going to be a large debate about that, but I think that's where this debate needs to go, is the impact it's having across the whole economy rather than not on any one particular group.
Okay, well, let's have a look at that issue then, Tim, because, I mean, if it's true that, despite whatever sort of fiddling the Chancellor is doing with the benefit system, the big picture is determined by the depth of austerity, well, there was pretty bad news in the budget, wasn't there? Because the austerity is going on longer and deeper than the Chancellor predicted. Growth is further off and postponed now a second time in the figure. So it doesn't look as if that big picture is being really addressed by the government's economic policies.
Sadly not. I mean, I think that everybody knew that we were in for a difficult time as a country after the economic crisis. And the question was always going to be, we know it's hurting, but is it working? And the answer that seems to be more and more apparent is that it's not working, that we're not getting the growth we need. The growth we need not just as individuals and households and families for our well-being, but the growth that we need as a nation to reduce the deficit. Because if we're not growing, then that deficit can widen.
I mean, Deven, what do you think is going on with the government now? Because even the IMF have told them that austerity is deepening the recession. I mean, the IMF isn't known for its kind of reflationary economic stance, but when the IMF says this to you, surely, if you aren't listening to anybody else, you might think they'd be listening to them.
So I think there are some steps this government's taken in terms of in this last budget to try and encourage growth measures. So there's a shift in spending toward greater investment. That's coming in a year or two's time. So more money going up into the regions as well to try and generate growth in those areas. But at the same time, I think there is a strong case. You have to ask yourself why austerity is necessary. And that's because actually we were spending quite a lot of money when the economy was going really well from 2002 to 2007-8, just before the financial crisis. We were actually still continuing, despite the economy growing time and time again, we were still continuing to borrow every year. And I think that's a mistake that you have to look back at and say, actually, if we'd been generating surpluses and actually saving money during those times, we'd have a little bit, we wouldn't be feeling the pain quite so much now.
Do you think I always feel that the use of the kind of inclusive we, which the government and the politicians do systematically on this issue, is a little bit disingenuous, because we didn't really deregulate the banks. We didn't cause the banking crash in 2008, but it is definitely we that are being asked to pay for it. So there's a if you're seriously trying to look at causal factors rather than make propaganda about who should pay for this, that we doesn't work, does it?
Yeah, I mean, you could easily say the government. I mean, I come at this from a policy perspective, looking at what decisions the government should be making. So perhaps the we says, the we in that sense is talking about the government should be doing this, and the government should be, these are the steps the government should be making. And that's the angle that in some ways I take when I look at what should happen. But in terms of, using who should be paying for this, there's definitely, it's on an individual, on a household basis. Having said that, we as a nation are all feeling the effects of this, and we as a nation are having to bear some of the brunt, some more than others. But that will be the nature of the policies that the government puts in place.
It's also worth pointing out that we as a nation at the household level are being asked to borrow more and more, or at least it's hoped that we will borrow more and more. One of the most interesting bits of detail to look into is always the Office for Budgetary Responsibilities report on what it thinks is going to happen to the economy and why. And if you look at the different components of where they think economic output will come from, and their belief that we will get back to growth of about 2.8% by 2017, it's very heavily dependent on households increasing their own indebtedness by an average of about £3,000 per year per household between now and 2017, 2018. So if you think about what caused the crisis in the first place, it was actually, rather than the government debt, which was fairly low, especially by international standards, it wasn't so much the government overborrowing, it was much more household debt that had been at the encouragement of all the deregulation of the financial sector.
Deven, I mean, when you look at the debt figures now, if you take out the write-offs, actually both household debt and corporate debt is actually larger now than it was in 2008. So are we remotely getting to the point where this problem can be solved?
There are also cash piles in those two areas. So I think one of the things the government's trying to do is, particularly in the corporate sector, where the government isn't spending, they're looking for the corporate sector to spend some of their money and build up some of the shortfall in investment, and that's why some of their investment in that's why they're willing to spend on things like road infrastructure, things like Crossrail, because the idea is that spending on those things will actually encourage people who do have money in their pockets, many of whom are households, many of whom are corporations, to actually invest more in this country and create jobs and growth, which is what we all need to try and get us out of this mess.
I mean, Osborne's been saying this since the very beginning, that that they'd cut back on public spending and the private corporate spending would fill the gap. Is there actually any evidence that that's happening? Because if you keep on having to postpone the recovery, it doesn't really look, well, if it is happening, it ain't happening on a scale that's actually ending the recession.
No, and I think it's taking time. It clearly is. I think one thing that George Osborne is right about is that if we were to do the opposite and actually get the nation into even more debt, then actually that is something that would spook some of the potential investors into this country, because actually they'd see a government that wasn't able to control its own spending and could see themselves having to pick up the tab in terms of future tax rises in the future. Same with households as well. Ultimately, when the government's spending more than it can actually afford, it's households and corporations that have to pay for it through tax rises at some point in the future if the government can't control its spending.
Tim, do you think the sort of capital infrastructure spending that the Chancellor announced is a kind of closet Keynesianism that Osborne seems to be engaged in while pretending to be a monetarist? Do you think it's enough? Do you think that the scale of what they've announced is enough to deal with the recession?
I think that a traditional Keynesianist would say it's not quite on the scale that a full Keynesian stimulus would be, and perhaps also criticise it for not doing enough in enough areas, because what businesses also want to see is customers, and the amount of money that householders have to spend in the economy to go out and spend in their local businesses and services is still being cut back with these multiple pressures, from cuts to the income support that families receive, and from the pressure of inflation still being above target, for example. So we're starting to hear more and more businesses saying to the government, well, do what you can for ordinary families, because those are the people we want to be spending in our businesses, and then we will have the confidence to invest.
Do you think, Deven, that what's happened to Osborne is that that his economic policies is verging on incoherence now, because it started off in a sort of classic monetarist phase. That hasn't worked, so we're now getting kind of ad hoc, capital spending to reflate the economy, but it may not be enough. So is he a sort of advocate of the muddle in the middle?
He's shifting, and it's probably a good thing that he's shifting. There are certain things that we can afford to invest in as a nation. Some of the infrastructure investment makes sense. There are a couple of other things that would make sense at the moment right now. One of them would be to build houses directly rather than to fund them through mortgage loan guarantees. I think the crazy cost of housing, and we were filming this in London, where it's pretty much impossible to buy for anyone on a normal income. If they're starting out without any particular deposit. It's taking, 10, 15 years for you to even save up for a deposit for a home right now. So there are things that he could be spending some more money on to actually not just put more money in people's pockets, but actually reduce the cost of living for everyone across the country. And those are the kinds of, I think, sensible measures that if George Osborne is moving in that direction, then actually, yeah, that's probably a good thing, and he could probably shift a little bit more.
Let's just have a little bit of a talk about the housing question, because many critics of the budget are saying that far from reducing the cost of housing, this will kick in another house price spiral, and it will, and all the talk of the measures that he announced being used for the buying of second homes. Has he miscalculated this?
I would think there's a risk of that, yes. I mean, obviously, families want to be able to get their first home. And you have this kind of funny situation at the moment whereby those who have a home are wanting to see house prices hold up because it's a valuable asset for them, whereas those who don't want to see the prices come down. So there's a big conflict in the country on that, really. Looking at it from a more balanced economist point of view, I think you'd have to say that the right thing to do would be to try and bring the price level down. And perhaps we need to be thinking a bit more longer term about a kind of economy and a kind of society where people have other forms of security for their families for the long term, so that they don't need to look on their house as that kind of asset for their security, because they know they're going to get decent protection if they become disabled. They know they're going to get decent protection in their retirement, and they know that there's going to be decent access to funds for their kids to go to university.
Let me bring Deven. We're coming towards the end of the discussion now,
Sure.
but I mean, I guess one of the things that Tim's saying is you can look at this as house prices are too high, or wages are too low, and jobs are too insecure for people to be able to get on to the legendary house price ladder. Is that a problem with the labour market, do you think?
It's probably a bit of all three, but I think economists would agree that house prices are too high by historical standards. They've never been this high relative to wages. And actually, I think if you're looking for a topic for the next general election, that's going to be probably a huge issue for those on low and middle incomes. Housing is probably going to be the critical one, because you have to remember it's housing that drives, yes, the cost of living for everyone. It's also housing that drives a large part of the benefits bill. So when you see the benefits bill going up, it's actually not increases in employment necessarily. It's the fact that a lot of that money goes on rent through housing benefit. So you're seeing actually a lot of money go into pockets of landlords and house builders that way as well.
What do you think about the labour market question, Tim?
Well, I think these are questions that we really need to move on to, particularly for the debate on benefits. I mean, we all understand that we need a social security system that is affordable for the nation for the long term. But the idea that you can achieve this by this endless salami slicing of entitlement levels without getting to some of the root causes, I think, is wrong. And as Deven says, one of the big root causes, absolutely, is the cost of housing and how much that has pushed up the housing benefit budget. But also the labour market as well, because we're subsidising too many jobs from the taxpayer that are simply not paying living wages.
I mean, just one final point on that. As well as housing, I think you also have to look at the benefit system and the way in which it's rewarded work. And the fact is that it hasn't for quite a long period of time. And actually one thing that this government's doing in terms of the way it's dealing with benefits and the deficit is to try and make sure that those decisions reward people on low incomes who are working relative to people who perhaps aren't, and just trying to make that decision much more clear-cut for people on the very lowest incomes.
OK, well, that brings us to the end of this discussion on Chancellor George Osborne's budget. I'd like to thank my studio guests, Deven Ghelani and Tim Nichols, and I hope that you rejoin us for the second part of the Politics and Media programme.